Thanks, everybody. I'm Mark Andreevich from the School of Media, Film, and Journalism at Monash University and co-lead of the data program in the ADM+S Center. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Frank Pasquale for our second keynote of the day. Frank is an expert on the law of artificial intelligence, algorithms, and machine learning. Before coming to Brooklyn Law, where he is now, he was Piper and Marbury Professor of Law at the University of Maryland. He is an affiliate fellow at Yale University's Information Society Project. His work on algorithmic accountability has helped bring the insights and demands of social justice movements to AI law and policy. In media and communication studies, he's developed a comprehensive legal analysis of barriers to and opportunities for regulation of internet platforms. In privacy law and surveillance, his work is among the leading legal research on regulation of algorithmic ranking, scoring, and sorting systems, including credit scoring and threat scoring. He's written 2 books that are probably quite familiar to many in our audience, addressing these and related issues: The Black Box Society from 2015 and New Laws of Robotics, both from Harvard University Press. Frank has many international ties. He is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Cross-Disciplinary Research in Computational Law, based in the Netherlands, and will be giving lectures on AI law and policy for researchers in Taiwan later this month. His work as a partner investigator with the Australian Research Council, Centre of Excellence on Automated Decision-Making, that's us, has brought him back to Melbourne today to address data protection law and regulation of digitized judgment in a wide variety of fields. I first came across Frank's work through his book on the Black Box Society, which I used in my Introduction to Digital Media Studies classes that I was teaching in the US. The students enjoyed his work so much that they drew on student resources, funding resources, to invite Frank to give a talk at Pomona, where I first met him, and learned that in addition to being a brilliant path-breaking scholar, he is also an incredibly generous, encouraging, and wide-ranging thinker. He is, of course, first a legal scholar, but is also a polymath, at home discussing literature, theory, philosophy, as well as the law. This is in part why his work is of interest to so many disciplines and what makes him such an appropriate keynote speaker for the Center's symposium. We are honored and delighted to be able to call him not only a colleague, but a partner of the Center. Please join me in welcoming Frank Pasquale back to Melbourne.
Oh, thank you. Wow. Thanks. Well, first, thank you so much, Mark, for an incredibly generous introduction. I have learned so much from your work and just the joy of being able to come here to get to know you better, to get to know so many of the great researchers here in Australia better, has been one of the highlights of my academic lifetime, my career in academia. And I really greatly appreciate that, and an honor to be around here today, so thank you. I think I can start up the presentation if that's okay, so I can start up. Here we go. Today, what I'll be talking about is the generative potential of rights to information access in an era of digitized judgment. So I know it's a somewhat wordy title. I apologize for the verbosity. But I'll try to break down each part of these aspects of digitized judgment in order to present some ways in which we can envision future collaboration between lawyers, journalists, social scientists, computer scientists, and others, activists as well, in making a fairer and more just future when it comes to the evaluation of persons. So I think that's really the core of this talk. We're going to go into some technical details about the law of access to information, but I want to be sure that that broad theme is always in view. So one of the things that we consider as we consider the digitization of judgment is the future of reputation and the future of human evaluation in many fields. As you can see, there are so many traditional gatekeepers who decide on the future of individuals, the evaluation of individuals. There are teachers giving grades. There are human resources departments deciding whom to employ. There are suicide prevention hotlines who are deciding whom to prioritize and who may just get a wellness visit later on. There are police and doctors as well that make life and death decisions. And as more and more data is collected, And as more ingenious computer scientists come up with diverse and ever more complex algorithms for processing this data, each of these traditional gatekeepers who are evaluating individuals are being complemented or even sometimes replaced by new technology. And I think that in each of these examples, part of why I put up this slide first is because sometimes I wonder, what is the unifying theme among all the diverse disciplines in this room, right? I mean, I've been thrilled over the past 10 to 15 years to be part of many conferences and workshops and interventions that call for algorithmic accountability. But the question sometimes comes, well, what unifies all of the people in the room with all the different disciplinary backgrounds? And I think it's a concern for accuracy, fairness, and justice as we make this great transition, not toward replacing human professionals and gatekeepers, but towards supplementing and improving their judgment and avoiding errors. I'll just drill down in the next couple slides into one example of how this could affect people directly, right? So we have, in the future of consumer finance, it may well be that we move from the baseline data, mainstream data, to fringe data in deciding who gets loans and who does not. There are already startups and lenders that are using things like social media activity, how people fill out a form, whether they're politically involved, all of these sort of factors to decide whether to give them a loan, whether to give them a higher interest rate, etc. I describe it in chapter 5 of my New Laws of Robotics books. And I think that this is an interesting opportunity because the entrepreneurs behind these systems say that's a way that we're going to include people financially who are not included at present in current systems. But it is also very worrisome because there are so many problems that can arise out of this data, and there are second and fourth order effects that can occur. To give one example of this, I don't want to give something that was a little fanciful, but that I think is helpful in envisioning potential futures, as I think in part to the great presence of artists and literature in this conference helping us imagine alternative futures. This is from a visual artist, Susie Cagle, who also does journalism. And she's imagined a future where on Facebook, first there's an algorithm that helps determine credit scores that is based in part on the credit score of your friends. And secondly, everyone that has the score on their profile. And in this imagined future of Susie Cagle, the data subject here, the Facebook profile of Jonathan Arrears, decides essentially that he needs to dump his low score friend because that's the only way to raise his score. I think we could all immediately bridle at this. Say there's no way we want this as part of our future of consumer finance, where people feel any sort of pressure to disassociate from others based on a low score. Right. But we have a lot of work to do on a legal matter to really ensure that this can't happen. And secondly, we have a lot of work to do simply as academics and as journalists. I think more fundamentally, to make sure that milder versions of this or secret versions are not occurring. Because there's a lot of concern, given the opacity of algorithms nowadays, that ranking, rating, and sorting systems may be using data that we would consider illicit or unfair in either crediting or discrediting individuals. I also think that there are stakes outside of finance, and so if we think about the aspects of computing as a research program, it's a very encouraging research program in some ways to develop computers that could understand people's emotions better and soothe them in some situations. But we also realize that there are examples of early deployments of computation that assesses emotion that are discriminatory or that are raising the stakes of one's self-presentation too high. So, for example, there are aggression detectors that analyze voices, apparently without consent in many American schools, that are essentially alerting principals, administrators to potential interventions against overly aggressive students. And when we have already concerns about a school discipline pipeline, that's very worrisome. That's a misuse of the technology. The second is that corporations are using affective computing to understand which of their customers they should invest in and which are the waste, that they don't necessarily need to put further effort into. Consultants have offered insurers spatial analytics designed to tell the real age of applicants. And this has been dismissed by legal scholars Jevin Hudson and Luke physiognomic AI. It's based on there's just such a bad history of using analysis in these areas. There was actually a letter signed by over 2,000 researchers calling on Springer not even to publish research trying to deduce characteristics of a person's personality or likelihood to be a threat, simply from their face. And I believe that's a very strong and powerful argument. But it does run into some calls for academic freedom. And so this is going to be an ongoing tension, I think, in the future. Is a tension between calls for social responsibility on the part of AI research and calls to ensure blue sky research. And finally, HR departments want to use AI to parse expressions and gestures. And that's an issue that comes up in many areas where there are, say, thousands of applicants for a few jobs. The demand for computation there is because no one wants to be the person who has to sort through 10,000 resumes. But as Ifoma Junior has pointed out, very interesting work called Paradox of Automation, Anti-Bias Intervention, there are ongoing concerns that if this type of automation is based on data that is based on practices, it will just replay those into the future. And a final example will be, I know we've all probably interacted with these smart kiosks. There are large problems from theft, automatic kiosks, people just punching in but not paying, or other things like that. Do we expect the kiosk to eventually become a police person? Do we think of the kiosk as something? Already we have kiosks that are recording people as they check out. Can they go further and analyze whether it looks like someone that looks like a thief or not? This again, I think, raises the stakes of evaluation and demands more transparency over time. Now, some of the questions driving rights to information access come out of the great Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandis's dictum. That sunshine is the best disinfectant. The idea that all of these rather troubling uses of computational evaluation on the horizons are already being used, that people need to understand. Answering yes to all these questions. If a company gathers data about you, you deserve to understand. If an algorithmic lender decides to raise interest rate based on your phone, understanding how those algorithms work, and if this automated checkout is classifying someone as a threat, being able to contest that. Now, of course, some of these things should not be happening at all. We can get into later how we can decide that divide. But at a very basic of regulation, which we're not at yet in many jurisdictions. I think we have to demand whenever this computing is deployed. One question, though, becomes how far can the data demand go? There was recently a California law that I'll talk about in more detail in a little bit that gave California residents the right to access their data. One journalist was very disturbed when she found every single page of the Kindle that she had gone through had been marked in the data set, how long she spent on the page, what words she looked up, when she drifted off from it, when she came back back to it, when she came back to it, this is all permanently stored. This is all permanently stored. And I think that as people learn more about the granularity and detail of data stored about them, the question becomes: are some of these large firms or even smaller firms that are collecting the data obliged to create data structures that will allow those data subjects to understand their profiles? And how far will this go? Another journalist demanding his Amazon data was disappointed because he found that while he got several of these categories of information with his data demand, he did not get the CCTV camera of him while he was in a Whole Foods store that week. And he felt like he was almost certain that it was something that actually was still in existence and that he deserved it. Should firms have to provide that? And one question that comes out of that as well is, if we do demand firms provide that, is that a way in which we are forcing them to create even more intrusive databases that would say match by facial recognition who's in the store to an existing Amazon profile, the one that they use, say, to check out. Because one of the dreams of Amazon with its Whole Food stores is that people could just walk in, take items off the shelf into their cart, bag them, leave without even paying. They would basically be automatically debited based on recognition by cameras of what they had taken. Now, moving on in terms of where the law is here, I wanted to look at some frontiers of determination in the U.S. and Europe, because that's the area I'm more familiar with, and I know there are familiar with many scholars here that are much more familiar with Australian consumer data rights. But I think that these give some really interesting frontiers for reform and for clarification of the consumer data rights. I know that there's rulemaking and inquiry into that this year here in Australia. And some of the case studies in the U.S. The Fair Credit Reporting Act and Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Fair Credit Reporting Act gives people an opportunity to see the dossier that was in deciding if they get a loan. But only in a limited range where something known as a consumer reporting agency has compiled the dossier. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act gives people the right to an explanation if they've been denied credit or given it on unfavorable terms. But the problem then becomes with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act is that a lot of the explanations are extremely short and not very useful to a consumer trying to figure out how to do better next time. So this is a big issue. Right now, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Federal Trade Commission are both saying to AI-driven lenders, we don't care how complex your models are. We want you to explain how the decision was made. But I think there are other voices in the U.S. government that are pushing back and saying this could stop innovation. And one of the things we really have to think deeply about when we demand meaningful information and explanation from algorithms is, do we think that if the explanation cannot be offered, we should simply ban the use of those algorithms in the covered area? So that's a possibility. I mean, we could be at a crossroads where we either decide to give up on principles of explainability, or to give up on forms of AI in human evaluation. And what I'm going to try to do in the rest of the talk is to say maybe there are ways around very stark divide, but we should always be cognizant of it. Europe, of course, has been dealing with a lot of these issues for much longer than the U.S. has. At least back in the 1970s, France had right individuals to understand how their data was being processed. And there were data access rights going back to the 70s, codified at an EU level in 1995 with the Data Protection Directive, and recently reinforced and given more teeth in the GDPR that was finally enacted in 2016 and then actually implemented in 2018. So as we go forward with these issues, there are some principles and questions for future regulation that we're going to have to address. And I bring these up because I knew this is a conference with a lot of social scientists may be interested in what are the sorts of questions policymakers are going to be needing to ask in the future in order to properly and specify information access rights. One principle is that
not all data is relevant or fair to include. But then the question comes, how do we actually analyze, understand very complex systems? That's going to be on the agenda for regulators around the world. A second is that the certainly data transparency. But how much is due? Are we going to demand that say if a company keeps CCTV camera footage, give that footage to anyone that it keeps record of? Or are we going to say perhaps that has consequences that we don't necessarily want to go down that road? Finally, data subjects can't manage the scoring deluge on their own. Right. They're going to need help from civil society groups, from unions, from NGOs, others, in order to really advocate for themselves and understand what's going on. But we also have to watch out for when AI users fight back and say that the demand for transparency has gone so far that it violates their trade secrecy and their proprietary information. So those are all going to be very important principles. Just to make this a little more concrete, the exact rights that are being guaranteed now. Under the 2018 and 20 California privacy laws, the CCPA and the CPRA, people have rights to know what personal information was collected about them, where it was sourced from, what it's being used for, whether it's being disclosed, whom it's being disclosed, and the final one is the trickiest. Meaningful information about logic involved in automated decision-making processes. And in some ways, as we're thinking about ADM and society, I think that one of our core missions can be trying to articulate what is the depth of that meaningful information that we're going to demand in a variety of situations. It's a hard question, and I think it's particularly some of the struggles that governments were going through in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s over due process. Lots of governments were being challenged over whether they were giving people full due process in either social benefit contexts, other contexts where very high stakes decisions the government were being made. And in many of those cases, what judges did in outside the U.S. they did proportionality analyses. In the U.S. they did something like rough and ready cost benefit analysis of the value of the interest at stake. How much more likely it would be a better decision if there was more process due to the person who's being decided about. But we're going to have to decide. What are the stakes? And when the stakes are high, I think to demand more transparency. And where there are lower stakes, less transparent. So, for example, when the bank is deciding using algorithmic systems whether to give someone a loan, there is already legislation as of 2018 in the U.S. to require validation of the model. But when we think about ads are being served to people, we may not necessarily get as much transparency because maybe the stakes are lower. But I'd love to explore with you further that question because it may be that we can't really answer the question of stakes. It's something that there just needs to be common sets of transparency no matter the application. I also want to note that there are at least major streams of critics of these access rights. Right, and one I would call the maximalist performers. Just to give an overview of this slide. Some say they do too little. Some say they do too much. So the too little crowd, the more maximalist performers crowd, believes that there's a transparency fallacy. That if we assume and fallaciously assume more transparency always leads to better results or lead to better outcomes. And Veal and Edwards slave to the algorithm certainly make that point. There's also the idea that too much burden on the data subject, and the complex models are impossible to explain. So that's the due to little crowd. And I'm going to try to address both of these crowds in slides here, just to give a sense of where we need to respond. Those who think it's too much, say that this is just too great a burden on corporations. Both Apple and Facebook have made this argument in response to demanding access rights cases in Europe. They've said, look, we'd have to totally restructure our database to really give you all the data that you want. So don't force this on us. And there also are cost-benefit analyses that are being bandied about. But the problem, I think, is that these cost-benefit analyses are partial, and that they don't fully recognize how much can be done via the use of these information access rights. And just to give a sense of that, there's an intrinsic value. Of knowing what's going on. So that's part of it, right? So that's part of it. I mean, that I think is a lesson of Charles Limbaugh's that we can inquire, and that helps us to change society in ways, just by understanding it better. But more instrumentally, there are values of helping people better navigate automating decision-making. We can be in situations where the better we understand it, the better we can help people navigate the increasingly complex automating systems that they are dealing with in their daily lives. Second, it helps remedy power imbalances. This is particularly the case in the Max Schrems case, where essentially Schrems exposed many problems with transfer of data between Europe and the US. And secondly, in the worker info exchange case recently, an association of gig economy workers who were drivers for Uber and Ola really helped level the playing field their understanding of bonuses were set, how incentives were set. They're beginning to get the data that they need in order to better bargain with and understand their position within the gig economy. Of course, I think there should be many more reforms to the gig economy, letting the workers know about what data is there. But if you look at the history of unionization movements and labor movements, a lot of times the core demand for labor unions has been, let's understand what's going on. When the boss says we can't pay you more, we would go out of business. Let us see the books. Let us see the books. Let us understand exactly what's going on. And I think this is a more modern version of that. I also think that civil society, academics, and contribute to the realization of these access rights. So there are, first of all, many privacy academics have shown us the wide value of understanding our data footprint. People like Daniel Sola have shown that people who have been victimized by data breaches, if they don't understand that, the reach and extent suffer undue risk and anxiety. There are also I think there's a wonderful paper by Simcoe Firth Pavlovian taxation of corporations for complex terms of service. Their idea is that when a corporation imposes terms of service on you that are extremely complex, it might take you 4 hours to read, but that's an externality. And that it should be taxed. And I know it may seem a little fanciful, but I think it's a really wonderful idea, because whenever the corporations say to us, you're demanding so much information, you're making our life so complex, I think we have to be able to say back to them, look, if you're going to use a model that has 10,000 parameters that we can't understand, you're making my life complex. Okay, so I'm going to turn around and make your life complex. So this, I think, is something that is really about the power imbalance, and it's about sort of thinking about how, with the rise of ADM, there can be consistent, coherent, and ethically compelling demands for further investment, just as much investment in the explanation of it as there is in the development of it in these fields. I also think there are just so many social benefits here, right? Many social benefits. I mean, I can't go through all of these, but just to give one example on the Dexia Bank case, this was a case that was essentially involving a bank that had missold securities to many people. And people that wanted to understand how they had been targeted basically were able to do information access requests to understand what was it about them that led the bank to target them for the securities that were inappropriate for them, that were essentially too risky or had other bad qualities about them, right? And as well as the Cambridge Analytica case involving David Carroll, a great example of educating the public about what's going on at some of the ad micro-targeters. Building information infrastructure as well. I think that's happening with Algorithm Watch in Germany and OpenSchufa. So all of these, I think, are great examples of trying to bring forward the social benefits of information access rights. They're not just about one person navigating a system better, although that helps, that's good, but they're also about building civil society and building up an information architecture and infrastructure that can enable further understanding of how ADM works. Okay? So I think that if we were to consider, in closing, I think that we can use access rights to measure and shape the societal impacts of these digital judgments. Right? I brought up at the beginning a lot of really potentially useful, but also potentially disturbing applications of ADM to persons in finance, in medicine, among shoppers, et cetera. And I think that substantively, we can use these access rights to better understand how scoring and evaluation is done, and how AI and ML are used in medicine, law, other fields, and the digitization of the administrative state. There, by the way, I would highly recommend a recent book edited by Bowie and Miller called The Automated State, which focuses on the use of automation in Australian public administration over the past 15 years. And I was inspired in part to go in this direction by how much those authors had discovered. And I think it's really a very inspiring book in considering how this digitization can be challenged and better understood. I also would note that there are many methods and forms of collaboration out there. Among legal scholars, comparative law, I think, is critical. There's so much to learn from different jurisdictions, and I've been learning this week from some of the best folks in consumer data law here in Melbourne, and I'm going to Sydney and Brisbane soon to learn more about how the laws are being made and applied here. And secondly, I think among social sciences theorists, there are critical contributions they can make. What are our terms of evaluation for success? As you can see from my discussion, oh, sorry, I didn't know that one was on too. As you can see from my discussion, there are a lot of normative questions that are raised. And I mean, it's very complicated normative issues are raised by the tension, say, between academic freedom and responsible use of research. And we need theorists to help us understand the foundational normative issues there. What are the best ways of measuring clear standards of success? I think that political and social scientists have so much to offer there in terms of giving us a sense of how we measure, once we've got certain goals, are we actually getting there? And finally, where are alternatives to dominant paradigms most needed? This is where I always try to put in a good word for interpretive social science. I'm a huge fan. I think that, while I think that much social science based on natural science methods is valuable, I think it always needs to be complemented with an effort to interpret the world and to be open to multiple interpretations of the world. So with that, I hope that this talk just gives a sense of, first, what information access rights are, second, how they can contribute to our better understanding of automated decision-making, and third, my great appreciation of the work of those at this conference in helping us to better understand our social world via these and other forms of inquiry. So, thank you.
Thanks so much for a really thought-provoking presentation that touches on concerns of so many in the center and so many issues that many of us are working on. We'll open it now for questions and feedback from the audience. Is there anybody? Oh, we've got one over here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the fascinating presentation and also yesterday's workshop. I'm Henry Fraser from QUT. I really support the recommendations you've made, but it's interesting to me that many of them require some form of intermediation. You're talking about unions or academics sort of inspecting data and then translating that into policy or recommendations or action. But what strikes me as absent from most of the forms of information is actually telling people what this means for you. Like last year, I did some, basic baby academic media training, and the message was, when you want to explain your research, you should always try and come up with a way of explaining to your audience, what does this mean for you in your life? So I think there's an opportunity in understanding the idea of meaningful explanation of the logic of an algorithm, not to focus precisely on the logic of the algorithm, but what that means in terms of lived experience. Do you see any ways of encoding that kind of norm, or do you see a path to arriving at that broader and richer idea of explanation and access?
I do think that's a really important point. And I think that some of the literature on explainability, on explainable machines, does really emphasize this idea that there needs to be intermediation. And I'm inspired a little bit by the US healthcare system. It can in some ways be characterized as a complex algorithm. I mean, it's just incredibly difficult for people to figure out what insurance they can get, how much federal subsidy they can get, what the ultimate out-of-pocket expenditures they would be maybe required to expend each year are. And in recognition of that, the Affordable Care Act funded these new professionals called navigators. And the navigators were meant to intermediate between people and the healthcare system. Now, of course, I'm certainly not recommending anything that complex anywhere else, but I think what's inspiring about the navigator role is the idea that there might be a need for new forms of professionals who can help to translate what's going on into people's lived experience. It also reminds me of the rise of the profession of genetic counselors. Yeah, so that I think both of those would be helpful. And I'll have to think further about that. But thank you. I think that giving people a sense of what it means to them is critical. I should also note, though, one caveat, which is that at present there's a big push for locally interpretable model explanation, where people will be like maybe having a sandbox, and let's say they do a credit, they get a bad credit score, and then they say, well, what if I lived in my apartment for 2 more years? Does my credit score go up? Well, it could be that at the time that they're consulting, it would go up, but that data at the end of the 2 years means it would go down. So what that means to me, I think that ultimately I saw a really wonderful proposal, I think it was by Sandra Wachter, or maybe by another scholar, that said that if a bank tells someone, here's the sandbox and do X, Y, Z, and you'll get a loan, that be an enforceable promise. So that could be one future path for regulation, is to basically temper the effect of purely algorithmic, purely mathematically driven evaluation of persons with requirements that to the extent that guidance and explanation is given, that they can hold the bank or entity to that guidance. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Frank. Dan Angus from QUT as well. My question is, in some of the work I'm doing with Mark on our Ad Observatory project in ADMS, one of the questions that we're encountering is around how the platforms around advertising transparency are providing differential access into different forms of advertising. So for politics, issues, elections, you get maybe grander transparency into those kinds of ads versus other products where we get very little access, if anything at all, into, say, financial products, alcohol, these kinds of other categories. And so the question is, when you're talking about some of these issues here, what are your takes on when you have like that difference across within a category even of what transparency might mean into those different kinds of categories, and how we need to kind of continue to kind of push for, even when transparency is provided, how we've seen, say, for example, Meta use that as a shield against then providing access. So they say, well, we've got this great tool now, and yes, it's great in some ways for the politics category, but it's not great in others. And so they're kind of using it as a way to kind of push back against and say, well, we've already provided this thing here and look at how great we are. So yeah, just any kind of, I guess, insights on that issue of that, differential kind of level of access as well.
Yeah, that was not something that I was really privy to or had known about. And so I really appreciate your making me aware of that. And I do think that could be the dark side of the proposal I had made, sort of tossed off during the talk about interest analysis, right? About how compelling the interest is. It does strike me that like being chosen to be marketed very unhealthy food or lots of alcohol or other things like that, that is a pretty important issue that people really need to be able to understand and to grasp if they are, say, in the top 10% of those marketed these dangerous products. And I recall there are some of these for-profit entities, for-profit universities in the US that are really have terrible track records of getting people jobs or doing other things like that, and they're being investigated for targeting in a predatory way certain groups of individuals via Facebook or other social media. So I think that the challenge there might be to identify areas where human welfare really is at stake and where there's a deep threat, and to demand as much transparency as possible, perhaps even at a state level or local regulation or something along those lines, but ideally at the highest level of government possible. Because you're right to say that there's a way in which, politics is only one thing. And frankly, I heard that recently that given their pivot to Meta, they're giving up on that. So I could be wrong about that, but I mean, there's some story about that they're even not, it's not really the focus. And to some extent, they never really signed up for it, but they have now accumulated so much influence that, that sort of transparency is really necessary. I think the problem, though, always comes up is this proprietary information trade secrecy thing. And so I think that the answer there is to have it in the back pocket, if they sort of play the card of saying, well, if you ask for too much explanation, I'm going to say that it's a trade secret, to say, okay, well, then we have to stop we stop advocating for explanation and transparency, and now we advocate for direct regulation, right? I think that has to be the issue. The ability of researchers, activists to do that. And I think when you're looking at some of the controversies over data access that I've seen, I think that could provoke that sort of response. So thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. One last question. Wrap things up.
Oh, there's one. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Frank, for your speech. My name is Natalia Lushina. I'm a research fellow at the ADM+S Center at MIT. And speaking of data access controversy, I wanted your opinion on, so I'm working with data, and you've been talking a lot about the rights and regulations and what Amazon should and shouldn't do. So we have so much conversations about data stored by corporations, and then I'm, as a researcher, had to jump a million hoops to get access to data stored by Australian Bureau of Statistics. So Australian Bureau of Statistics, that has way bigger wealth of data than any Amazon or whatsoever, hides their data from the researchers and makes it really difficult to access and then use it, and every finding has to be checked and vouched if it can be shared. How did we get to that point where the data that's like we own as a society is hidden from the researchers who are only going to do good, and then we have Amazon who does whatever they want, and on Facebook collects the data and do whatever they want with it?
It's a great question. I mean, it's a really important question, and I think, I think that one of the things that worried statistical agencies or other government bureaucracies was the work on re-identification. So I think that might be the thing that, and I can't speak for the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and I certainly sympathize with you in terms of saying that there's so much important government information out there that could be so useful in research that is effectively blocked out of people's hands. And I really worry about that. But I think there was this Massachusetts situation where essentially they released certain medical records that they thought they had properly anonymized, but the researcher LaTanya Sweeney revealed that you could very easily re-identify people based on their zip code, birthday, and gender, or something along those lines. And so I think that may be it may be that, given concerns about privacy, they are doing this sort of check. Because what I was describing actually, and your question really intersects with an interesting area of civil society advocating on behalf of people who want to access their data rights. Because if a person says, I want my data from a corporation or from the Statistics Bureau, that really doesn't threaten anybody else's privacy, usually. There could be a little bit of a threat to privacy, like if I want all of my Facebook posts, if it includes all the comments from everybody at some point, that maybe there's some interesting questions there raised about do I get access to their comments as part of my personal information? But if it's a researcher looking at 100,000 people and a certain number of issues, there might be some concerns. So I'd have to think about this particular context to really directly address it. But I think that as you see more civil society groups trying to exercise individual access rights on behalf of people, where say a union says, we want all the data that Uber has on all of our drivers, then the similar issues that you're raising might come up there too. And it would probably be good for the state to get its house in order to enforce against corporations if it wants to do that. So, thanks.
Thank you so much. We've run up against the end of our time, a little bit over. I really appreciate your time. If you could all give a huge round of applause to Frank. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.